What's up, Meta Nerds? This is going to be a complete breakdown of all of the Clone Trooper variants, all the different armor types, the designs on top of that armor, specialized units, weaponry, all that kind of stuff. Pulling from every source available in both Legends and Canon. So let's get into it. Of course, the first was the Phase 1 armor, distinguished by its smooth, finned helmet and relatively limited customization. Despite minimal peripheral vision and discomfort, Phase 1 armor did offer excellent protection. Rank was indicated by color-coded armor markings. Clone commanders wore yellow, captains red, lieutenants blue, and sergeants green. Though later canon material does kind of blur these lines. They're not strict rules and they usually get phased out as units adopted more unique designs. All clones carried the DC-15A blaster rifle or the compact DC-15S carbine. And while Jedi generals led the clone forces, clone officers, often designated by colored pauldrons or additional armor like commas, they were the next in command executing these battle plans. So the standard infantry Phase 1, the basic clone trooper that made up the bulk of the Republic Army, wore plain white Phase 1 armor with unit logos or minimal decorations, especially in the earliest battles of the war. Usually they're always seen wearing blaster rifles and having a thermal detonator, forming the backbone of offenses all across the galaxy. High-ranking clones in Phase 1 armor were distinguished by those colored markings and command gear in the Clone Commander class, or CC. As you'll see in their alphanumeric designations, CT is for your standard clone trooper, CC is for clone commander. The CCs were bred for this role, having a different genetic makeup and going through specialized training since birth. Commanders like CC-2224 or Cody, or CC-7567 Rex, sometimes added gear like macro-binocular visors on their helmets, or even more unique pauldrons, being proficient in all sorts of weaponry, though of course some like Rex preferred their pistols.
It's all in the wrist.
And CCs like Rex often have even more individualized armor like Rex's Jag Eyes markings, rather than following any strict color codes, especially as the colors became associated with battalions. Because really what we end up seeing is that different groups just have different colors, not strictly tied to leadership. Clone Commander Fox led the Coruscant Guard security clones in red Phase 1 armor, and Clone Commander Gree led green accented forces on Kashyyyk. Obviously they weren't all captains or all sergeants. ARC troopers are even more elite variants of clone troopers, trained for special missions and operating with more independence. And in Legends, the Kaminoans produced a limited number of Alpha-class ARC troopers, like ARC-77 Fordo, personally trained by Jango Fett, showing heightened combat skills and tactical creativity. It's a dark comparison, but how they were genetically crafted and trained creates a very similar scenario to the droids in the CIS. Your average rank-and-file CT was like your B1 droid, and the more specialized the droid was, the more advanced programming, the more freedoms it had, just more capabilities in general. And so remember, these clones were bred, they were destined for each of their roles. CTs, clone commanders, ARCs, they're all programmed differently. The ARCs were the least restricted, the most like Jango Fett, and many of them also personally trained with him. Wearing modified Phase 1 armor with an added pauldron, the comma, waist, cape, or skirt, and often a rangefinder on the helmet. And they too usually had bold color accents, like blue for Fordo. Rex wasn't the only ARC to favor twin DC-17 hand blasters, and they often carried specialized gear, like ascension cables and detonator packs. And though I say they were originally bred for their role, like Rex being on par or even more intelligent and creative than most CCs, you are working with biology, so it's not 100% predictable. And so to make sure to capture some of this uniqueness, there was also ARC training programs.
Gentlemen, who wants to be an ARC trooper? I do that!
Where we see those like Fives and Echo earned their way into, not being born or destined for it, and they eventually donned Phase 2 ARC armor later in the war.
You're both officially being made ARC troopers.
And like how we know the 212th is led by Kenobi, it's not the same thing with ARC troopers. They have no specific Jedi commanders, but are plugged in with different generals and work special ops. Advanced Recon Force troopers, or ARF troopers in their Phase 1, were reconnaissance specialists trained to operate light vehicles, like AT-RT walkers, and perform stealth missions behind enemy lines. They wore lighter Phase 1 scout armor, including a streamlined helmet with a narrow visor, and often camouflaged color schemes for forest or desert warfare. These scout clones excelled at long-range patrol, ambush, and forward observation, calling in airstrikes or guiding ATTE tanks from the front lines. They typically carried DC-15 carbines or sniper rifles, and the most famous of these were under Jedi General Luminara Unduli's reconnaissance unit on Geonosis and Commander Bly's 327th Star Corps patrols. Phase 1 clone pilot armor had a large visor and life support tubes, plus a chest-mounted breathing apparatus, while their armor usually had yellow or gray markings and lacked the fin on top of the helmet. These pilots usually just carried small arms like DC-17 pistols, in the worst case of being shot down, having to survive against predators and potential enemy forces. Clone medics, like the name suggests, had a life dedicated to specialized medical training. They wore standard Phase 1 armor, but marked with blue circles or crosses, and sometimes a backpack of medkits, making them easy to identify on the battlefield. Carrying emergency Bacta, surgical tools, and portable scanners, while still being armed with a basic blaster. There's the Explosive Ordnance or Bomb Squad troopers, who wear a rare Phase 1 variant with bright orange markings and specialized gear like ordnance sensors. A Bomb Squad unit led by Sergeant Boomer is seen during the Naboo Blue Shadow Virus crisis, working alongside Skywalker to disarm Separatist bombs. Their orange-striped Phase 1 armor made them easily recognizable among standard troopers, and they carried modified DC-15 blasters for close quarters, and a ton of specialized tools to dismantle explosives. Then we have the Clone Engineers. Similar to the EOTs in that they're both trying to stop things from being destroyed, they donned lighter armor, often with yellow highlights or even pilot-style helmets, and had a ton of equipment like fusion cutters, detonation packs, and shotguns for defense, being able to quickly repair vehicles, set down mines, or breach doors. They were essential during armored assaults, keeping everything from AT-TEs to LAAT gunships operational, and could even help on board capital ships. Now in the final 2 years of the war, from 20 to 19 BBY, we see the armor and units evolve. Phase 2 Clone Trooper armor was introduced, offering improved comfort, better sensors, and a more angular helmet design that would become transitional to the Imperial Stormtrooper look. This armor allowed for even more individual customization, at a time when the feeling of clone individuality was also rising. In the original canon, this is when we start to see the distinct colors and patterns that we think of with the clones under certain Jedi, like the 501st blue accents and the 212th orange. This armor was more expensive, but superior in every way from protection to flexibility. By now, the whole idea of colors representing rank was gone, and now it's almost 100% indicating unit affiliation or just personal expression. And we get some new weapons like the Z6 rotary blaster, a minigun for heavy units, and the DC-15X sniper rifles for marksmen. Again, your standard infantry is going to have this basic Phase 2 armor. Some were still in white, but mostly you have Skywalker's blues, Kenobi's orange, Mace Windu's 187th in purple, and Aayla Secura's 327th Star Corps in yellow. The helmets had enhanced HUD displays and better filtration systems for the various worlds that these troops would find themselves on. And famously during the Siege of Mandalore, Phase 2 332nd Company troopers painted Ahsoka's colors on their helmets. We see the clone officers and commanders personalizing their armor and capes even more, sometimes tacking on the latest tech. And in Legends, some of the late war officers often adopted Stormtrooper-style armor upgrades. This was toward the very end of the war. Now, Phase 2 ARC Trooper armor often retained the comma and pauldron of Phase 1, but with the new helmet design. Some like Alpha 17 and Fordo upgraded their Phase 2 armor, and even helped train other clones in ARC techniques, all citing that this newer armor was not just some gimmick or some government contract way to waste money. It was a genuine upgrade that made them more effective on the battlefield. And this is also when we see the clone commandos clad in their Katarn-class commando armor, even more advanced than the Phase 2, though being slightly heavier, but more customizable, and with different camo coatings and an even more enhanced heads-up display. Usually operating in 4-man squads like the famous Delta Squad and Omega Squad, and even Clone Force 99. Many carried the experimental DC-17M rifle system, with M being for modular attachments. One weapon platform that could become like a shotgun or a sniper or anti-armor role. Now in Legends, there were 100 squads that were trained on Kamino by instructors like the Mandalorian Coy Valdar, directly under Jango's leadership. And after Order 66, surviving Republic commandos were recognized in the Imperial commando units. And this comes back in canon with clone commandos like Gregor being seen training conscripted TK troopers, these new non-clone forces, the earliest of stormtroopers. And these commandos really did play a unique role, being the most advanced in stealth, slicing, or hacking, and marksmanship, And crucially, they were almost always operating without a Jedi, in small unit tactics deep behind enemy lines, setting them apart from all other clones throughout the war. We also get the Phase 2 clone pilot armor, being very close to what would become the Empire's scout troopers. These were often camouflaged, they were lighter weight, had visor goggles, and thinner chest plates for mobility, kind of the opposite of the bulky Katarn class. Then there were the units that adopted certain paratrooper gear for high-altitude drops and other hazardous environments. The 212th Attack Battalion's airborne troopers wore distinctive Phase 2 airborne armor, with a stylized narrow visor, flared helmet, and chest cape. A sort of extra layer of protection when you're coming down through atmospheres, even things like bits of ice that might do damage. They often carried standard rifles, but some were equipped with grappling hooks and rappelling lines. They could be deployed from AAT gunships at high altitudes, or using jump packs or rappelling cables to reach difficult positions. They often had extra breathing filters on their mask, allowing them to operate in dusk, smoke, or high-altitude thin air. The most seen during the attack on Utapau, but also in the 327 Star Corps, where they have specialized armor for drop missions on worlds like Felucia, and they usually match the color scheme of their unit. The Galactic Marines were an elite clone unit, easily identified by their maroon-colored Phase 2 armor and heavy weaponry. Led by Commander Bakara and Jedi Coyote-Mundi, they specialized in hostile environments, particularly cold weather and vacuum conditions, operating in space. Their armor had this distinctive helmet with a visor slit and environmental seals, precursors to what we'll see with the snowtrooper gear. They often had DC-15 blasters or the PLX-1 missile launchers or rotary cannons, all in their heavy assault infantry role. When the Separatists were using their armored units to hold down the bridges on Megiddo, these Marines showed up and put those missile launchers to work. They originated from the 21st Nova Corps and had Mandalorian-influenced training, so we can infer that they were likely bred for this role as well, and were of those clones with a more free programming, allowing them to be highly adaptable, but still very disciplined. The clone Scuba Troopers had a sealed Phase 2 helmet and a rebreather mouthpiece, swimming fins, and an integrated oxygen supply, wearing distinctive patterns like the blue stripes, and carrying weapons like the DC-12 underwater blaster, which was specially designed to fire plasma bolts underwater that could still travel fast enough and be effective. I really wish we could have seen what that thing does when it's fired in atmosphere above water. Is it insanely fast and more deadly? But just like real-world underwater training being used to help in space, these scuba troopers were also used in zero-gravity fighting conditions and deployed during space boarding actions, with a lot of the kit and tactics being the same for an underwater mission or in assaulting a spaceship or space station. Flame troopers were very rare, but they carried the BT-X-42 heavy flamethrower, used for everything from clearing bunkers, caves, and Geonosian hives. Wearing modified Phase 2 armor with extra heat shielding, sometimes a reflective visor, with armor that had red or orange fire pattern markings, and carrying gel fuel backpacks. They were also used on Felucia, where these flames burnt away the fungal forests that were a perfect hiding space for Separatist droids, with the clankers not being affected by these organic, fungal threats. Clone troopers couldn't pursue them into these forests until the flame troopers showed up and cleared the path. As you might expect, Jedi generals were particularly disturbed by these weapons, but their effectiveness is undeniable, and the common tactic was to have them work in teams with heavy trooper support in order to protect their volatile fuel tanks, as you could easily see a chain reaction effect if one of these packs was hit by a blaster bolt. And while the Galactic Marines often used heavy weaponry, there was still a specialized role called the Heavy Weapons Troopers, having pauldrons and ammo packs, similar weapons like the Z6 rotary cannons, PLX missile launchers, but also experimental weapons like ion cannons and other miniguns. Hardcase in the 501st and Boyle of the 212th served as heavy gunners, and they're seen with red and blue highlights and specialized helmets and rangefinders. They were often paired with engineers or standard troopers, where the heavies would lay down covering fire while the lighter armed clones advanced and secured the area. Though you could imagine they had a low life expectancy, attracting a lot of fire, which freed up their clone brothers to advance, but meant that everyone was trying to cut them down as quick as possible. While they started off rare and were not an official branch like the ARC or Pilot, these heavy specialist roles were sort of organically developed within ranks, and nearly every company by the war's end had at least one dedicated heavy weapons trooper in their unit. We see the Phase 2 shock troopers, serving as the Coruscant Guard under Commander Fox. They have specialization in electrostaffs and riot shields. and would have to put them to increasingly frequent use during the end of the war, as protests and eventually all-out riots broke out. And details seem to indicate that just as all the other clones were bred for their specialization, shock troopers seemed to be exceptionally disciplined and loyal. You can imagine, since they're supposed to be with the highest ranking officials, you want as little independent thinking as possible, a fanatical, absolute obedience to orders that are given to them. So you might lose a lot of creativity, but they weren't operating deep behind enemy lines like commandos. A ton of them are working together and should be operating with a home field advantage, almost always on Coruscant, or on rare diplomatic missions where every detail should have been planned out with overlapping areas of security. The covert ops clones were the rarest variant, and they had experimental stealth armor with black-gray camouflage, a Phase 2 design, and even sound-dampening footprints. They were deployed for espionage or sabotage missions, and we can imagine if the war went on for several more years, this prototype tech could have been combined with something like the Katarn-class armor. They did sacrifice a lot of protection for that agility and all this cloaking tech, but they did often train alongside commandos, focusing on hacking, silent takedowns, and intel gathering. Now that is it for all the clone troopers, but I do want to end on some of the transitional forces, and those first years of the Empire where blending clone forces are turning into the emerging clone trooper corps. Right when the Republic became the Empire, everyone was still wearing their Phase 2 armor, but now it would have a standardized Imperial colors and designations. No more personalization on the armor. Eventually the Stormtrooper armor was directly based on the Phase 2, but with more helmet modifications and a standardized all-white plating. One of the most famous exceptions was Darth Vader's 501st Legion, or Vader's Fist, which remained an all-clone unit for a long time. The Empire was quick to cut ties with Kamino. Palpatine wasn't about to have his whole empire dependent on one alien species, and he wanted as many citizens as possible to see themselves as part of the war machine. Having enlisted stormtroopers meant that more people were financially tied to him, and psychologically it works too because it has the effect that when rebels kill someone that you knew, and it has a great psychological effect too, because these stormtroopers are coming from all across the galaxy, often from poorer families and just poorer worlds in general, which would actually be the most susceptible to the arguments pushed by the rebellion, the most likely to be anti-Imperial. But when you have friends and family who are in the Stormtrooper Corps who get killed by the rebels, you're more likely to see them as the bad guys and Palpatine as the good guy who just wants stability and order. Then you have the case of many Republic shock troopers of the Coruscant Guard seamlessly transitioning into Imperial service, swapping the Republic insignia for the Imperial crest, but continuing to wear red detailed armor and enforce security on the Imperial Center. These two would stay cloned for far longer than your rank-and-file clone trooper. In the months after Order 66, Purge troopers were introduced as Jedi hunting forces directly under the command of Lord Vader and the Imperial Inquisitorius. They were clone troopers, often Republic commandos, and they received further specialized training and had to survive an engagement with the Jedi. They wore distinct black armor with red markings, a mix of Phase 2 armor and other more experimental components, and had electrostaffs, sniper rifles, and other so-called anti-Jedi weaponry. These were clones for about a year or two, before, like all the other ranks, they were replaced with recruits. The most difficult aspect of their training was to make them immune to Jedi mind tricks, often done by having corrupted Order 66 survivors, so Jedi who had turned to the dark side, having them develop the minds of these Purge troopers. The Imperial Commando Special Unit was formed from veteran squads like Delta and Omega, who chose to continue serving. The Republic emblem gets switched with the Imperial Cog, and painted portions of their Katarn armor black, taking part in eliminating the first of these early resistance movements and hunting down Jedi or even rogue clone troopers. They often played one of the biggest transitional roles, being training instructors for the incoming stormtrooper recruits, and they answered directly to Vader or their local Moff, skipping the normal chain of command in the military, and they would cause a lot of frustration because they never had to explain what they were doing. Just tell some sergeant or admiral to take it up with Vader. And the most disturbing are the Phase 0 Dark Troopers, an early attempt by the Empire to create cyborg super soldiers from the clone veterans, wanting to squeeze as much usefulness out of them as possible, not wanting to give up a mind that was forged by the Clone Wars. Some of these veterans were fitted with extensive cybernetic enhancements and heavy exoskeleton armor, basically just wanting to force their minds into these Dark Trooper droid bodies. In theory, the strengths of the CIS army and the most advanced clone troopers all in one package. But this monstrosity would eventually erode the minds that it was trying to preserve, and it was just too much trouble, ultimately phased out in favor of the purely droid Dark Trooper phases. But the most common were the TK Troopers, those first non-clone units, though in the early years operating alongside and being trained by clone veterans. So I hope now you better understand all these different variants. If there's anything I missed, please put it down in the comments, and hit that like button. It really is the best way to help me out. Subscribe so you don't miss anything, but most important of all, remember, war is hell, but it creates a lot of cool stuff. And the Force will be with you. Always.